Hello dear students, welcome. Today we shall be discussing about the concept of public-private partnership, which is commonly known as PPP mode or 3 Ps. The late 20th and early 21st century saw a clear trend towards governments across the globe making greater use of various public-private partnership arrangements. Public-private partnerships are portrayed by their proponents as a solution to concerns about the growing level of public debt during 1970s and 1980s. They sought to encourage private investment in infrastructure initially on the basis of ideology and accounting fallacies arising from the fact that public accountants did not distinguish between recurring and capital expenditures. Not only this, but there have been growing concerns regarding management of public sector institutions in different countries. The public sector was considered such an instrumentality of the state which could help in meeting the challenges of employment and infrastructure development for greater public good. However, due to varied reasons, the public sector in many cases did not stand the test of time, and the governments were constrained to look to private sector for its contribution in a more effective manner. However, absolute surrender of government control was not considered in the fitness of things, and hence a new model of partnership between public sector and private sector was evolved so that the government can capitalize on efficiency, technology, and the strengths of private sector without losing its grip on developmental decision making and initiatives. Public-private partnership, as the name indicates, is a long-term arrangement between government and the private entity to join hands together for completion of a project. Typically, it involves private capital financing for government projects and services upfront, and then drawing revenues from the users for profit over the course of the PPP contract. Public-private partnerships have been implemented in many countries and are primarily used for infrastructure projects. PPPs have been entered for building, equipping, operating, and maintaining schools, hospitals, transport system, water and sewerage systems. The Government of India has defined public-private partnership in 2011 as a commercial legal relationship under an arrangement between a statutory or government-owned entity on one side and the private sector entity on the other. The objective being the provision of public assets and or public services through investments being made and or management being undertaken by the private sector entity for a specified period. There is well-defined allocation of risk between the private sector and the public entity, and the private entity receives performance-linked payments that conform to specified and predetermined performance standards, measurable by the public entity or its representative. Contemporary public-private partnerships came into being around the end of the 20th century. It was aimed to increase the private sector involvement in public administration. PPPs were seen by governments around the world as a method of financing new or refurbished public sector assets outside their balance sheet. While PPP financing comes from the private sector, these projects are always paid for either through taxes or by the users of the service, or a mix of both. PPPs are structurally more expensive than publicly financed projects because the private sector higher cost of borrowing, resulting in users or taxpayers footing the bill for disproportionately high interest costs. PPPs also have high transaction costs. The private company is chosen through an open, competitive bidding process and is compensated depending on performance. Both parties, that is public and the private, invest in the project in terms of financial sense, that is manpower, materials, budget, and in an expertise related sense, that is knowledge, networks. The parties contribute to a societal and also to a commercial purpose. Dear students, we need to understand in a very concrete term as to how the new model of executing projects through PPP mode can be beneficial for the country and the people of a country. Let us have a look at some of the advantages of public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships help in introducing private sector technology and innovation in providing better public services through improved operational efficiency. Next, it incentivizes the private sector to deliver projects on time and within budget. Next, it imposes budgetary certainty by setting present and the future costs of infrastructure projects over time. Next, it helps in utilizing PPPs as a way of developing local private sector capabilities through joint ventures with large international firms as well as subcontracting opportunities for local firms in areas such as civil works, electrical works, facilities management, security services, cleaning services, maintenance services. Next, it helps in using PPPs as a way of gradually exposing state-owned enterprises and government to increasing levels of private sector participation, especially foreign, and structuring PPPs in a way so as to ensure transfer of skills leading to national champions that can run their own operations professionally and eventually export their competencies by bidding for projects and joint ventures. Next, it makes the country more competitive in terms of its facilitating infrastructure base as well as giving a boost to its business and industry associated with infrastructure development, such as construction, equipment, support services. Next, it supplements limited public sector capacities to meet the growing demand for infrastructure development, helps in extracting long-term value for money through appropriate risk transfer to the private sector over the life of the project. The benefit of a PPP is that when appropriate cooperative agreements between the public and private sectors are employed, the management capabilities and financial savvy of private enterprises may result in better value for money for taxpayers. Next advantage being when a project is funded through a public-private partnership, it can either be completed sooner or become feasible because investments are made by the private sector entity for a predetermined amount of time. Next, public services may become more effective, efficient, and competitive as a result of PPP. In a situation when there are budgetary constraints, it can raise additional funding and supplement the limited public sector capacities. The next advantage being that public-private partnership does not constitute privatization because it entails the government's complete retention of responsibility for delivering the services. The division of risk between the public institution and the private sector is clearly defined. Next, in developing nations, when governments are constrained in their ability to borrow money for significant projects, the PPP approach may be an alternative. Next, it may also provide the necessary knowledge for large-scale project planning or execution. Dear students, I hope you might have got an idea as to what is a public-private partnership and how it is helpful. Now we need to know and understand what are the different forms of public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships take a wide range of forms, varying in the extent of involvement of and risk taken by the private party. The terms of a PPP are typically set out in a contract to outline the responsibilities of each party and clearly allocate risk. Different types of PPP are concessions, build, operate and transfer, design, build and operate, performance contracts, and a few more. The private entity enjoys a concession for use of the asset to recover its cost and margin. A concession is a grant of rights, land or property by a government, local authority, corporation, individual or other legal entity. Public services such as water supply may be operated as a concession. In the case of public service concession, a private company enters into an agreement with the government to have the exclusive right to operate, maintain and carry out investment in a public utility for a given number of years. We shall now be discussing some of the PPP models for a more clear understanding of the concept. Number 1, build, operate and transfer, which we call as BOT. B-O-T. Build, operate, transfer represents a complete integration of the project delivery. It follows a standard PPP paradigm where the private partner is in charge of designing, constructing, operating during the agreed upon period and handing back the facility to the public sector. The project's private sector partner must provide the funding and assume responsibility for its construction and upkeep, usually a greenfield project. The public sector will permit business partners to charge users for service. After some concessionary period, the facility is transferred back to public sector. A key illustration of the BOT concept is the national highway projects that National Highway Authorities of India has leased out under the PPP form. Now the next mode is build, own, operate and transfer, which we call as BOOT. A BOOT structure differs from BOT in that the private entity owns the works. During the concession period, the private company owns and operates the facility with the prime goal to recover the costs of investment and maintenance while trying to achieve a higher margin on the project. BOOT has been used in projects like highways, roads, mass transit, railway transport and power generation. Highway and port construction also utilizes the BOOT concept. Now next is build, own and operate, which we call as BOO. In a BOO project, ownership of the project remains usually with the project company, such as a mobile phone network. Therefore, the private company gets the benefits of any residual value of the project. According to this approach, a private entity will retain ownership of the newly constructed facility. The public sector partner consents to buy the goods and services delivered by the project on mutually acceptable terms and circumstances. This framework is used when the physical life of the project coincides with the concession period. A BOO scheme involves large amounts of finance and long payback period. Some examples of BOO projects come from the water treatment plants. The next is build, lease and transfer, which we generally call as BLT. Under BLT, a private entity builds a complete project and leases it to the government. In this way, the control over the project is transferred from the project owner to the lessee. After the expiry of lease period, the ownership of the asset and the operational responsibility is transferred to the government at a previously agreed price. Next mode of public-private partnership is BOLT: build, own, lease and transfer. In this strategy, the government grants a building concession to a private company and possibly designs it as well. The facility may be owned by a private business, which may then lease it to the public sector and transfer ownership of the facility to the government after the lease term. Next mode is design, build, finance and maintain, DBFM. In this case, the private sector designs, builds and finances an asset and provides hard facility management or maintenance services under a long-term agreement. The owner, usually the public sector, operates the facility. This model is in the middle of the spectrum for private sector risk and involvement. Now, the next mode of PPP is design, build, finance, maintain and operate, which we call as DBFMO. Design, build, finance and operate is a project delivery method very similar to BOOT, except that there is no actual ownership transfer. Moreover, the contractor assumes the risk of financing until the end of the contract period. The owner then assumes the responsibility for maintenance and operation. The private construction company is responsible for the design and construction of a piece of infrastructure for the government, which is true owner. Moreover, the private entity has the responsibility to raise finance during the construction and the exploitation period. Usually, the public sector begins payments to the private sector for use of the asset post-construction. Now, the next is design, build, operate and transfer, abbreviated as DBOT. This funding option is common when the client has no knowledge of what the project entails. Hence, they contract the project to a company to design, build, operate and then transfer it. DBOT is a variant of the build, operate and transfer, that is BOT contract model, where the contractor is responsible for both the project's design and construction, because it identifies a single point of accountability for delivering the project and seeing it through to operation. This approach may be appealing to some clients. Examples of such projects are refinery construction. Now, the next mode of PPP is design, construct, manage and finance, which is abbreviated as DCMF. So, in this case, a private entity is entrusted to design, construct, manage and finance a facility based on the specifications of the government. Project cash flows result from the government's payment for the rent of the facility. Some examples of the DCMF model are prisons or public hospitals. The next mode of PPP is operation and maintenance contract, O&M. In this type of PPP, a private economic agent under a government contract operates a publicly owned asset for a specified period. Formal ownership of the asset remains with the public entity. in terms of private sector risk and involvement. This model is in the lower end of the spectrum for both involvement and risk. Now, the next is build and finance, BF. The private actor builds the asset and finances the cost during the construction period. Afterwards, the responsibility is handed over to the public entity. In terms of private sector risk and involvement, this model is again on the lower end of the spectrum for both measures. The next is LDO, lease, development, operate. In this kind of investment arrangement, the public sector organization or the government keeps ownership of the newly built infrastructure facility and receives payments under the conditions of a lease with the private promoter. It is primarily used for developing airport facilities. Dear students, next is OMT, operate, maintain and transfer. The OMT model is comparable to BOT model with the exception that unlike the BOT model, OMT does not call for the concessionaire for a project. For a predetermined amount of time, the concessionaire is responsible for maintenance under the OMT model. Dear friends, let us now see how our country is responding to the PPP mode of infrastructure development. That is, we shall be having a look at the PPP in the Indian context. As of November 2020, around 1100 public-private partnership projects were launched in India. As we know now, the public-private partnership or PPP or 3P, by whatever name you may call it, is a commercial legal relationship defined by the Government of India. The Government of India recognizes several types of PPPs, including user-free based BOT model, performance-based management maintenance contracts, and modified design build turnkey contracts. Today, there are hundreds of PPP projects in various stages of implementation throughout the country. The Government of India is actively promoting PPPs in many sectors of the economy. Some of the recent developments in PPP initiative in India are: number 1, health sector. Niti Aayog, that is National Institution for Transforming India, has come out with public-private partnership model to bring changes in the health sector. As per this PPP model developed by Niti Aayog, the gap in the medical education and the shortage of qualified doctors will be addressed. As per this model, existing or new private medical colleges will be linked to functional district hospitals. Now, in the power sector, Government of India is planning to launch the Atal Distribution Transformation Yojana scheme. As per this scheme, if states will involve private sectors to improve the efficiency of state distribution companies, then the central government will provide incentives to the states. Such a scheme did not exist earlier. If India needs to become a $5 trillion economy, then it requires a healthy power sector. The three important segments of power sector are distribution, transmission and power generation. If progress needs to be done in desired pace and direction, then the distribution segment needs to be established as the strongest link. Hence, the central government is focusing on increasing efficiency of the distribution segment through Aditya scheme. Most of the developed countries have privatized their power distribution segment. The public-private partnership model introduced in 2002 in Delhi has proven to be a success. Delhi Vidyut Board was privatized by selling its majority stake, that is 51%. Now, the railways. Tejas Express is the first private train in India under the public-private partnership model. The services in the Tejas Express will be provided by private players. Services will include housekeeping, catering, ticketing, refunds and parcels. The physical infrastructure for the Tejas Express will be Indian Railways. It includes coaches, locomotives, guards, loco-pilots, etc. Now, in the area of urban housing, through public-private partnerships, that is PPP, government-funded housing in cities or urban areas will be converted into affordable rental housing complexes. This will be done so that the migrants can avail housing at concessional rates in cities or urban areas. So, dear students, I will stop here and looking forward to our next meeting where we can explore a new and exciting topic. Till then, take care and goodbye.